Welcome back. It's always a delight to say we are joined by Bill Walton, the host of The Bill Walton Show, a terrific television podcast that I've been privileged to be on myself and admire greatly. Bill has a lot of experience in the financial sector. He was the president and CEO of a big company up on Wall Street, the Allied Capital. He has been a leader of the conservative movement. We're delighted to have him with us always. Bill, welcome back.
Great to be here, Frank.
A lot to talk about, not a lot of time. Let me ask you about China, Bill. There are signs that the Chinese capital markets are beginning to suffer from the cumulative effects of both social policies on the part of the Chinese Communist Party, social public health, whatever you want to call them, the COVID, zero COVID policy, and of course the lockdowns that flow from it, notably in Shanghai, and now it sounds like it may be coming to Beijing as well. Give us a sense of what this means for both the markets themselves and investors in them.
Well, we're about to see a cataclysm in the economies worldwide. We're already seeing the effect of the sanctions imposed on Russia by both the United States and Europe and many of the rest of the countries around the world, which is really hurting economic activity here in the West. And we've thought, sort of in a sinister way, that maybe China's benefiting from all this. Well, President Xi sees it differently, and he is in effect imposing his own sanctions. He's imposing a zero COVID lockdown on almost the whole of China. And its effect on economic activity and social activity and well-being has been catastrophic. And we hear about Shanghai in the news, and that's important. It's the world's largest port, 4 times larger than the port of Los Angeles, 25 million people, home to about 800 multinational not headquarters, but significant operations, and over 70,000 foreign firms. Well, that's been completely shut down. There are little glimmers of hope, all in this ephemeral, the chasing this ephemera that Xi thinks he can create zero COVID in a country of 1.4 billion people. It can't be done. And the surprising thing to me is that President Xi believes he can do that.
Mm-hmm. And the effects, as you say, are not confined to China. We're starting to see supply chains impacted throughout the West, and to the extent that we have allowed dependencies on those supply chains, particularly here in the United States, there will be knock-on effects here as well. And Bill, I guess just to come back to the markets for a second, does that argue for a fresh look at the advisability of continuing to invest in Chinese stocks, which has been a hardy perennial and still the mantra of guys like Larry Fink of BlackRock? He says we ought to be tripling our investment in China at the moment.
You and I have been talking together about this for over a year now, and it seems like we get a fresh look every couple of weeks about why you do not want to be invested in China if you're an American investor, both from an economic perspective and from a national security perspective. If you care about America, you don't want to be investing in Chinese companies, many of whom controlled by the Chinese Communist Party are manufacturing stuff intended to kill us. Mm-hmm. I'd like to circle back, though, to the COVID lockdowns in China. It's not just Shanghai. He's locked down, I think there's, of the 100 largest cities in China, they've locked down about 80% of them to some degree, including many of the other major manufacturing facilities or plants. And that, the impact on the whole, trucking has been shut down, manufacturing has been shut down, Taiwan Semiconductor, which has got a big operation there, is shut down. We're seeing a meltdown of all these pieces of the economy. And it brings back to what we've learned with the lockdowns here in the United States. We had a political class who believed they could take the economic web or fabric and snip it in this place and that place and hopefully protect themselves from COVID. Well, you can't do that. Everything's interrelated. And if you snip in one place, the fabric comes apart. And I'm stunned that Xi would not have seen this in China shows a remarkable blind spot in his thinking about his ability to control an economy. And
Yeah.
if you're in the West, it's actually pretty good for us because the guy is wrecking his economy and his country just at the time when he seems to have the greatest strategic advantage.
Well, I wonder about that, Bill, and the skeptic in me suggests that maybe there's an ulterior motive here, which is to, yes, do harm to his own people and economy for sure, but in the process, perhaps have a multiplied effect on the rest of us. And it goes back to kind of the China model of the COVID virus in the first place. Yeah, there'd be some pain associated with it internally, the loss of life, and probably an awful lot more than we've been told, to be honest. But the damage done to the United States, to President Trump's reelection prospects, and to other economies that compete with China was even greater, I think.
Well, Frank, you're right. She could be playing a very deep game here, and then he's willing to sacrifice his own economy near term in order to wreck the West.
Mhm.
China, U.S. multinationals have not, for all the talk about reducing dependence on China, that hasn't happened, and our so-called supply chains are just as interrelated as ever.
Yeah.
And so we're seeing all this backup in China affecting imports and exports here in the United States. And Xi might
And
be willing.
manufacturing inside the United States too.
Exactly. And
Yeah,
so Xi may be playing a deeper game here that he's willing. Of course, we know they're willing to sacrifice tens of millions of people in China. They've done it
done it
repeatedly.
right.
It may be a deep game,
Yeah.
and we would be very mindful of understanding how that game's playing out and protect ourselves.
Amen. Bill, just on the hardy perennial here, because I think it's so important when we talk about these financial investments by mostly unwitting American investors in China, it's a form of life support for that regime. And, perhaps one of the parts of a deep game, if there is one, is the continued expectation that America's investor class, at the behest of the masters of the universe, like you used to be up on Wall Street, will provide life support, as I say, to the regime. Um, of a particular question at the moment is something we talked about last week, and it's continuing, I think, to become more and more of a concern, and that is that the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, which oversees the largest pension fund in the world, our federal government employees' pension fund, seems determined to get those government employees, past and present, military and civilian, hooked up in this Chinese life support operation through something called a mutual fund window. Let me just ask you, Bill, as a practical matter, if government employees are not apprised of whether mutual funds have, as part of their portfolio, investments in China, um, this would really seem to me to be a breach of fiduciary responsibility on the part of this board. It's there are risks, as you say, and the risks seem to be growing. Um, mustn't there be, at a minimum, transparency before this thing goes forward for these employees of the government to know whether they're putting their money, as you say, perhaps in companies that are building weapon systems with which to kill them, for heaven's sakes?
Well, yes, there needs to be transparency, and the argument the investment board is making is just really paper thin, if even that. They say, well, there's 6,000 mutual funds that 5,000 mutual funds people can be invested in, and many of them are aligned with the Morgan Stanley International Index, MSCI, and that
Mhm.
contains roughly 7,000 firms worldwide, about 90% of the investable equity universe. And they're basically saying, well, look, it's way too complicated to go into that index and understand which companies are Chinese or partially Chinese. And you can't expect us to do that work. Well, if you stop and think about it, and we've had a chance to think about it, is Wall Street responds to incentives.
Mhm.
All the investment board would need to do is say, look, guys, if you want to be included in our investable universe, you need to come to us with the due diligence that shows that these funds are not invested in Chinese companies.
Right.
they would respond. They've got the staff, they've got the economic incentive to do it, and I think pretty quickly they could come back with indexes which are cleansed of companies that mean to harm us.
Or if they choose to do so, at least disclose that there are companies in there that mean to harm us. Due
Well,
diligence is an operative word here, Bill. It seems to me that there's been an awful lot less of that, if I can use that expression, than there should be on the part of these firms. Again, just from a financial point of view, let alone as to whether they're investing in companies that enable the human rights predations of the Chinese Communist Party, to say nothing of national security
then
threats to our country.
you'd have to take Apple out and Nike.
Well, among others,
I
you
mean,
would like to have incentives, as you say, Bill, to those companies not to be doing business with the Chinese
big
Communist
picture,
Party either.
Frank, we're looking in a world now where we can't just act as economic creatures. We got to act as people that care about freedom, and
Yes.
we're asking the CEOs of these big companies to do just that.
Yeah.
And instead, they've thrust their interest into ESG investing and not really thinking about the well-being of Americans. And
Right.
that I think
That
we
that
need
has
to
to
keep
stop.
calling that out.
Amen. We do it here with you each week, and we're so pleased to be able to do so. Next up, we're going to talk with a man that you interviewed recently, and we'll talk about the interview with him, Dr. Peter Vincent Pry, a very important conversation about the dangers that we're facing now on the nuclear side, let alone on the financial side. Bill Walton, thank you for your time today, as always, and we look forward to visiting with you again next week. Next up, Peter Pry, right after this.